Hi, this is Paul. I know in the video I released today, I said I probably wasn't going to be able to do another video, and I know all of you who remember my vacation from last summer are going to give me a lot of crap about making videos on vacation. But as many of you know, the Rubin Report did what, at least from my aspect of the Jordan Peterson phenomena, was a really important conversation. And my wife had to go to work this afternoon, which I didn't know about. Usually Saturdays are honeydews and chores and family, and so I don't usually make videos on Saturday. But she went to work so I can make a video. So here we are, and we're going to have to talk about the conversation at the Rubin Report because it was a big one. And this is only going to be a this is going to be a conversation that we return to quite a bit because Peterson has. It's clear that so Dave and Jordan have been traveling together, and if you've been to any of Peterson's, what I call his evangelistic crusade, Dave Rubin takes the questions, and I think Dave Rubin has a good understanding of the kinds of questions that are coming Peterson's way now. And so he very much directed the conversation as a good host should towards conversations that the audience really wants to hear. I saw the Rogan Experience. I was a little disappointed in that conversation just because it focused on most of the things that most of the Peterson conversations have been focusing on in terms of the mainstream media, and the aspect that I'm most interested in is a little bit different. And Dave Rubin and Ben Shapiro, I thought Ben Shapiro was a very helpful conversation partner in this. I thought it was a really good talk. So let's dive in. Now, I'm going to want to treat lots more of this than I'll have a chance to treat this today. My wife walked out and said, "Well, how long are you going to be videoing?" I said, "Well, this is going to be at least 1 to 2 hours." And she says, "Well, how do you know how long your videos take?" And it's like, well, I kind of look at them and say, well, there's a lot here to talk about. So let's jump in.
All right, so let's dumb this down for just 1 second, because I want to ask a question that I know you don't like getting when we get in the Q&As, but I think it would be interesting for the three of us to sort of kick it around here, which is for the average person that's listening to this, that can only take in so many of these ideas and so much of it.
Now, they had just been through a really good section on some consciousness, on a bunch of things. I'm going to want to go back and look at that deeper dive later. But Rubin is, well, we'll let Rubin ask the question.
I think that actually is most people that are just living their lives. I think a certain set of people are listening to both of you and going, all right, these two guys think that some guy is talking to them from the sky. I mean, I know this is the most, I know why you don't love this question because it's so ridiculously oversimplified. But how do you get to those people then? For the people that think, well, wait a minute, what are you talking about? Shapiro loves facts over feelings, but he's talking about this imaginary sky guy that wrote this book and blah, blah, blah. What do you think is there a psychological trick to sort of get people over that hump if you wanted them to start exploring some of this?
That's a great question. And Peterson begins by going in all the wrong places here because he begins by getting esoteric. Now, if there's anything I've learned about Jordan Peterson after watching him for the last year and a half, is that he thinks out loud. And so every time he tries to answer this question, he is thinking out loud. And every time he works on it, he either explores the field a little bit more or refines it a little bit more or focuses a little bit more. And I think what he's been doing through this book tour, and as he said to Joe Rogan, he does a different speech every night, which I pretty much figured out when I listened to what he said in Sacramento, that he's continuing to process this and he's continuing to work on this. And so, in my opinion, he's making progress. Now, Dave Rubin's question is, of course, the question that pastors deal with all the time, because the job of pastors is to talk about these things. And what Rubin is saying essentially is, well, this gets complicated. So I'm about to do exactly what I criticized, just finished criticizing Jordan Peterson for doing. Because here's the deal. If you go all the way back to my Hoffman videos, all of us deal with representations all the time. Okay? When I look out in the room I'm sitting in right now, I am looking at representations of everything. And these representations, this gets into the a priori filter that Peterson had been talking about. This gets into the type of things that my eyes are and the limits of the limited spectrum of light that my eyes can capture, the way my brain processes what I can hear, all of this. And so all of this is a representation that I am able to perceive and that my mind is able to capture. Now, when my dog walks into this room, my dog sees a slightly different room than I do. And if there's a housefly in this room, and all of you can go to YouTube and look at those interesting YouTubes about how houseflies look, okay? So the world is a representation. Now, when we're talking, we're using verbal representations. And so what we're trying to do is answer these questions, but all we can offer each other are these representations that we can understand. Si yo hablo en español, algunos de ustedes me entienden, pero otros no me entienden nada. In other words, what I just said in Spanish is that when I speak in Spanish, some of you can understand me, and others of you can't understand me. And we have this in all of our lives. So what's lurking behind this conversation in many ways is the question, what do you need to know to live well? Okay, this is Dallas Willard's fundamental question that he dealt with. This really is a pastor's question that he deals with. Now, you get into tribalisms, okay, and what tribalisms are communities of representation. Within that tribe, a community has a certain set of representations that it uses to try to articulate that which is most important to them, that which they believe is most true, that which is most valuable. The difficulty that you have is if you go into another tribe, not only might there be substantive differences between that which is most important, both in terms of actions and objects, remember the main fork at the beginning of maps of meaning, but also the representations of that which is most important. So as we get into this, we're going to get into Protestant Catholic issues, we're going to get into Christian Jewish issues, and along the way, there might sometimes be differences of substance, and there might sometimes be differences of representation, because we are all the time trying to articulate and represent in words or in actions, or, and actions are in many ways a more powerful, fully embodied, incarnational representation in words than words are. And this is why Peterson likes to say, I act as if God is real. I act as if Jesus rose from the dead, so on and so forth. Every time Peterson says that, he's basically understanding that actions are far more incarnate and therefore have many more layers of representation than mere words do. All right? So there's just a real brief summary. Now, Rubin comes into this, and Rubin says, okay, we just talked a lot of the esoteric stuff. We were talking about philosophy and phenomenology and the history of Western civilization and what the Enlightenment is and how indebted the Enlightenment is to Christianity. And Peterson just finished saying, but you need the mythos. Without the mythos, you can't understand anything. And Rubin stops and says, hey, wait a minute. You always get the question, Jordan, about whether you believe. Now, believe is one of these powerful representational words, and it's also a tribal word, and that's part of the reason that Peterson avoids it and resists it all the time, because he doesn't want to get pegged in one of those tribes. Now this has part to do with Peterson's temperament, and it's part to do with Peterson's mission, and it's probably just part of who he is, and the communities that he feels comfortable in and the communities that he doesn't feel comfortable in, the communities he's had good experiences in, like the academy, and perhaps the communities that he hasn't had good experiences in, for example, the church. Okay, so he resists that language, and lately in more and more videos, and Jonathan Pageau has captured this. I said, yeah, this is when Peterson says, I live as if, that's a translation for believe. But Peterson is critiquing it and nuancing it and butting it and all of that. But those who say he doesn't believe in God, this is all the ambiguity. He's not dodging it. He's not playing cute. He's not avoiding it. If you look at Jonathan Pageau's Q&A November 2018, I think Jonathan is dead on right. I don't know Peterson like Jonathan has. I've never been to his home. I've had I had a tiny little conversation with him at the VIP thing when he was in Sacramento. I had about a 35-minute conversation with him, the recording of which is sketchy. That's on my YouTube channel. But I don't know him like Jonathan Jones. Jonathan says when you meet him, he is exactly the same person he is all the time. Now, I, as a pastor, watch people a lot. And even through this thin section, I certainly, in this thin window called YouTube, I certainly can be fooled. But my take on Peterson is exactly like Pageau's. I think he is just exactly who he represents himself to be. And as Jonathan mentioned in the Q&A 2018, I mean, when Jordan took a minute out of his time, a few minutes out of his time he had to find my email address, and he sent me a condolence email for my sister. That is, I am a tiny little YouTuber. I'm a pastor of an insignificant church. He gained nothing from doing that for me, but it impressed me, and it said to me, this guy cares. This guy cares. Who am I that he should care about? I mean, he's got millions of people, but he cares. So anyway, so Rubin says, okay, all of this esoteric stuff, Shapiro and Peterson, that you're talking about here, people just want to get down to the basis of it. They just want to get down to the nub. Why don't you two just start talking plain? Now, what do you mean by that? Why don't you use representations that are commonly understood and live with the ambiguities, without the nuance, with the fear of confusion? Let's see if we can make progress on this.
Well, you know what I mean? We can do the high level stuff for hours and hours, but eventually it just keeps getting to a sort of small.
Look at him! It's like, this tries the poor man's soul, because remember his rule: be precise in your speaking. So he wants to be precise, but it's as if he has a little bottle and he wants to make sure that all the liquid goes in that little bottle and none of it spills. And in a sense, Dave Rubin, now he's his friend, they've been traveling together, says, you're going to have to use a pitcher, Jordan. It's going to be sloppy. Lots of stuff is going to spill. But please say something that regular folks can understand. And what he initially does, well, this is just who he is.
That people can get to.
Is he saying a little prayer?
All right, so that's so hard a question, and so I'll try to address it this way. So
and again, it's hard because he wants to be precise, and it's hard because this is just where he's at right now. He is a very intense guy, and he is really trying to get this right in the shape and worldview he has. Now, for me, having grown up in the church, being a Christian minister, do you believe in God? Yes. That's what Mr. Reagan asked in his interview of me. Do you believe in Jesus? Yes. Do you believe Jesus is the Son of God? Yes. Well, now if you say, well, what do you mean by that? Oh, now I'm going to be rubbing my face and say, okay, it's like somebody called me up last week, and I get this often as a pastor, because I'm a pastor of a church who answers the phone, because I'm the only one at church. I pick up the phone and someone calls and they say, Pastor, are you the pastor? Yeah, I'm the pastor. What kind of church is it? I could say Christian Reformed Church, but hardly anybody here in California would know what that would mean. In Western Michigan, yeah. California, not so much. So then I'll start with Protestant. Nobody knows what that means. Start with Christian. Well, they kind of assumed that when they called. And you'd be amazed how difficult it is most of the time when regular people call who have some motivation to just maybe figure out churches. It's alarmingly difficult to have that conversation. And Peterson knows that. That's why he's rubbing his face and doing all this stuff. And Peterson, so when I say I believe in God, I believe Jesus is the Son of God, I am locating myself on a tribal landscape generally in North America that I'm comfortable with. He isn't. Okay, you might want it another way. It's just how he is. Just Come to terms with it. It's not a big deal. The poor man is trying to tell us exactly what he thinks as precisely as he can.
A line in the New Testament where Christ says that no one comes to the Father except through him, which is a hell of a thing for anyone to say.
Now go back and watch my conversation from, oh shoot, I can't remember his name right now. Shoot, I've talked to so many people. But he asked this question in an American East Coast, and Peterson has been reading Lewis, and right here, what Peterson says here, he's grappling with Lewis's trilemma. I'll back it up a little bit.
I mean, there's to the Father to address it this way. So there's a line in the New Testament where Christ says that no one comes to the Father except through him, which is a hell of a thing for anyone to say. I mean, there's a lot of statements in the New Testament that are strikingly strange in that manner. I am the way and the truth and the life. That's another one. It's associated with the same idea.
Yeah. And we'll get to some of the New Testament, Old Testament stuff.
So here's the idea, and it bears on your question. Although
now I was going to go very esoteric here, but it really does track and connect if you can take the little journey with him.
I don't exactly know how. It's as if there's a spirit at the bottom of things that is involved in the bringing to being of everything.
And Julian, who saw this, Julian's I had a conversation with Julian. Julian's a Canadian. He's a Hutterite. He said, bingo, he's a theist. I mean, that's essentially what a theist would say. So let's go back.
And it bears on your question, although I don't exactly know how. It's as if there's a spirit at the bottom of things.
It's also as if there is. It's just how the dude talks.
That is involved in the bringing to being of everything. So for example, people talk about evolution as a random process, but that's not true. It's not true. The mutations are random, but there's also a lot of other sources of genetic variation. But the selection mechanisms are not random.
Okay, the selection mechanisms. Now, I do have queued up, I didn't make a PowerPoint for this, but I do have queued up the God 1, God 2 part of the Vancouver 1 conversation with Jordan Harris. God is highly involved in selection. Now, some of you might say, if you know a little bit of Christian theology, well, you're a Calvinist. Of course you believe God is involved in selection. Yeah, God is involved in selection. And that's precisely the aspect of God that we don't like, because selection is hard on us because it defies our wills. Anyway.
So now then the question is, what are the selection mechanisms? So I'm going to have to go a bunch of places to answer this
Survival
question. Well, here's one selection mechanism. Yeah. It's like, so human females are very sexually selective. That's why you have twice as many female ancestors as male ancestors. So the male failure rate for reproduction is twice that of the females. Okay, so the question is, well, how is it that males succeed differentially? And the first answer is, well, females reject. Human females reject. But then the question might be, well, they reject on the basis of what? And the answer is, well, it's something like competence. And then the question is, well, how is competence defined? And then the answer to that is, well, men put themselves in hierarchies and they vote on each other's competence. And it's really counterintuitive in some sense from an evolutionary perspective, because you'd have to ask yourself, why would men put themselves in positions where they elevate some men in status and then give them a huge reproductive advantage, given that that's to their reproductive disadvantage in some sense? Okay, and there are reasons. Part of that might be, well, let's say you decide to follow the best leader in a battle. Well, then you don't die. Like, he might get all the women, but you don't die, so at least you're still in the game. Yeah. And it might be the same if you're following the greatest hunter. And the greatest hunter wouldn't be the person who is best at bringing down the game. It would be the person who is best at bringing down the game and sharing it and organizing the next hunt and all of that, right? And so men will organize themselves into groups and privilege certain men, and that puts them ahead in the reproductive hierarchy. And so what that means to some degree is that there's a spirit of masculinity that's shaping the entire structure of human evolutionary history. That's what that means. And then I think, okay, well, that might...
Now, spirit of masculinity, he is using... word. Okay. Remember what I started early saying, all of our words are representations. And so it is helpful to, as best we can, to understand things, what we essentially do is we line up representations together. The whole project that Jonathan Pageau is doing with the symbolic world is an attempt to line up all kinds of representations, because we don't understand any of the elements until we understand the relationship of them all. All right? So when he says a spirit of masculinity, he is using that word in a very complicated way in that moment. Now, part of the difficulty we have that is, if you live in the West, when you hear the word spirit, spiritual, remember words that fudge? When you hear the word spirit, your mind will go in a particular direction. And that particular direction has been created by all of the relationships that have been going on in the West for a very long time with respect to this word spirit or spiritual. And so a spirit of masculinity. So some of you are thinking about what, like a ghost of masculinity, like an angel of masculinity, like a demon of masculinity, like a principality or power of masculinity. But he's talking biology. And so what he means here by spirit is something not necessarily metaphysical, but not necessarily not metaphysical. Okay, that gets really complicated. And when you look into my conversation that I had with Jonathan Pageau about angels, that's where Jonathan Pageau went. And when I was having the conversation with him, I was a little confused, because again, we understand these words in relationship to one another and all the other different words. And our minds are incredible in that we navigate this, but we don't navigate this in terms of the binary fashion that computers do. We navigate this in other ways, and we don't even understand how we navigate the meaning of all these words. That's why I'm excited about Rebel Wisdom talking to Ian McGilchrist, because he works on some of the stuff in some really interesting ways. So there's a spirit of masculinity. And now also don't forget that Peterson is a Jungian. So Jung uses sometimes the way when Jordan Peterson uses the word spirit, it reminds me of the way Jung uses the word spirit, okay? But I don't necessarily want to map them completely onto each other, because I think Peterson in some ways goes off and does his own thing from Jung. But there's a spirit of masculinity. There's a sense of something that governs, let's say that. There's a principality or power of masculinity that has gotten built into us biologically. That's where he's going with this.
It might just be a biological epiphenomenon. And so
now an epiphenomenon, again, there's epigenetics. Epi, that's a Greek, it's a Greek I can't get my words out. That's a Greek prefix. It's an epiphenomenon. It's something kind of a little above phenomenon, a little around phenomenon. So it's not material in itself, it's much more relational. Because here's part of the problem with materialism. Daniel Dennett in his conversation on Unbelievable said, well, it's material plus information. I thought that's a crappy word choice for that. What it is it's material plus relationship, and the relationship, we represent it as information, but it's relational. And sometimes relational can be plotted on an XYZ axis, but sometimes it's only plotted, oh gosh, I don't want to use this word. It's only plotted on, it's probably the best word for it, it's probably plotted on a spiritual relationship. Because I don't have another word for it, because I don't want to say relational relationship.
So it would be a spirit it's the spirit of positive masculinity that manifests itself across epochal ages, millions of years perhaps, and it actually has shaped our consciousness, actually.
And then when he says actually shaped our consciousness, this is into our biology, it's into our psychology, it's into our brain chemistry, it's also into all of our relationships. It permutates it. So if you go back and look at some of the videos I made, again, about the Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson, when I was talking about the gods, when I was talking about polytheism, those are the gods. Those are the principalities and powers. Now you might say, well, are they exhausted by the relationships between human beings? A theist would say, no, remember there's a spirit at the bottom of this manifesting. That's a very theistic understanding of this. But we don't know, and we can't say, and as Christians we say, well, we very much believe by virtue of revelation that there are other spirits. Now, are they nearly exhausted by materiality plus relationship? No. But as, again, my conversation with Jonathan Pageau about angels and demons, these are principalities and powers. So in a sense, what Peterson has said, this is the principality and power of masculinity, of good masculinity, of healthy masculinity, of competent hierarchical masculinity, that some men will say, yes, my king, sleep with, take the best woman of the land, and may she be your queen, and we all will celebrate that. Read King Arthur. It's essentially what happens with King Arthur and the heraldic. So read Tolkien, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. I mean, this is what's represented in it. C.S. Lewis, with all of his medievalism and his heroism in this, he sees this, and Peterson says this is built into us. It is a spirit. It governs. We can feel it in ourselves, and it's even biologically set within us.
So you can think about that as a figure, and it would be the figure that emerges. It's like
figure. What kind of crazy accent do you have, dude? Sorry, I just couldn't resist.
It's like the essential spirit of all the great men who defined what greatness constituted. That's a spirit. Okay, now that's a purely biological explanation.
Okay, that's a spirit. It's a purely biological explanation of a spirit. So now some theists will kvetch and but again, Peterson isn't open. I don't know. He's getting to the border of agnosticism here. He's open about this because he keeps saying, he is not precluding the possibility that there is in fact a realm. That's because, again, that's a representation, and it's a representation that it's a word that has meaning. It's all in relationship to these other words. A realm, it's like when he says at the beginning, a spirit underneath this. Now, some of you are going to say, oh, you keep stopping in and talking. Well, go back and watch Rubin's thing. He's got the whole thing running in real time. You can come back here and watch me chop it up. I just don't have time today to run through it and then go back and run through it again.
You could say, well, that's God for all intents and purposes. You might essential spirit of all the great men who defined what greatness constituted. That's a spirit. Okay, now that's a purely biological explanation. You could say, well, that's God for all intents and purposes.
Now, he's not saying that exhausts our idea of God, or that alone is God, or only this here is God, but he's saying God is a word of representation that we use to talk about that dynamic in our lives. So when the king is coronated, or the king marries the queen, and the entire nation comes and celebrates this union, what language do we use? God brought you together. Okay? We use it not just for kings and queens, we use it for everyone. We use it. I use that language in weddings all the time. God brought you together. Well, and now Peterson's saying, okay, well, what aspect of God? Well, this spirit of masculinity has been governing in terms of the hierarchies, and that's been built into the women and built into the men, and that's been going on. Now, to have that entire conversation would be extremely cumbersome. So what has human society reduced that all into? It's reduced it all into a little three-letter word in English. There, takes the middle letter out. God. God brought us together. There it is. There it is. That's God. Now again, if you're an atheist or materialist, you might say, okay, I guess I can understand this shorthand way of you saying it. That's a representation. And okay, fair enough. But now we're going to have to get into the question of consciousness.
You might have an image of that built right into you. Even the sense that you can experience something divine and paternal might be merely a reflection of that evolutionary process. So that would be a biologically reductive argument for the existence of what we experience as God.
That's God number one, right there. And as you can see, even if you're an atheist, you don't necessarily have a problem with that. And one of the things you should appreciate is how through thousands of years of human development, societal development, the development of language, that we have been able to take these ideas and pack them so tightly into a little three-letter word, into something that's in relationship to all kinds of things. And essentially what theology does, and what my job is in terms of pastoral, a pastor is an applied theologian in a sense. So we're not technically academics, but we try to apply theology to people's lives. That's part of what pastors do. But all of this is boiled down into this little word called God. Now again, if you say, well, do you believe in God? Well, now as I've given you this definition, a whole bunch of you could say, well, I don't believe there is a consciousness in the sky that I can relate to, that if I in fact do something towards him, he will do something towards me. Oh, okay. Well, that's never going to get to God number two. What we're talking about here is God number one. And even Sam Harris can listen to this and say, I kind of get what you know. It's this consciousness thing that trips me up. And just to back up, again, if you go back over my videos where I talk about where I'm processing his little 5-part Easter thing that Peterson did in 2018, Easter 2018, when he talks about sacrifice. When you talk about sacrifice, now we're getting into God number two, because now we're getting into the relational in a new way, and we're going to get into consciousness.
But then there's another possibility too, which is that that's actually reflective of a deeper metaphysical reality that has to do with the nature of consciousness itself.
Now we're going to get into God number two.
And I would say that I think that's true. I believe the biological case, and I believe the biologically reductive case, but I don't think that exhausts it. I think that there's a metaphysical layer underneath that the biology is a genuine reflection of.
Okay, this is key. So now he's just basically laid out God number one. Dave, you can thank me, because hopefully what I'm doing is interpreting Jordan's answer. I'm willing to be more sloppy. I'm pouring a jug into a tiny little bottle, okay? And I'm allowing a lot of spillage. That's what pastors do. We spill. Academics, they like to be precise. Pastors, it's like, boom, we broadcast. We spill. So there's God number one. Now Peterson's saying, I am not a crook. It's weird watching myself do this. God number two. What is God number two? Well, there's more to this. There's more to this. And Peterson knows this, because why did sacrifice go viral in the prehistoric world? Well, Peterson is a Darwinian, and even in fact, Brett Weinstein can get close to this. Well, because it must have worked. Well, why did it work? And then Peterson goes into, well, sacrifice is the discovery of the future, and you're making a bargain with the future. And okay, so that still doesn't necessarily get us into this conscious thing. And so if you go back and if you look at, again, Vancouver 1, Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson is laying out all this God number one stuff, and Sam Harris is like, no. It's not what everybody means when they talk about God. Well, what do they mean? Well, it's like Verizon Lisa saying the universe wants me. Well, what is want? Want is a function of a conscious agent, a conscious being, and so consciousness has to have a piece of this.
And that's the sort of the macrocosm above and the microcosm below. That we are really reflective, including in our consciousness, of something about the structure of reality itself.
Okay, so what he's saying here is that if in our biology we can feel pretty comfortable about God number one being reflected in our biology when we all celebrate that King Arthur and Guinevere, the best man of the land and the best woman of the land, and if they come together, and if they are king and queen of the land, then the entire land will prosper. Or you can do Tolkien, you can do Aragorn and Arwen, and the entire land will prosper. Okay, so okay, and we can say, well, a good king makes the land prosper. Okay, God number one. God number two, if in fact this spirit of masculinity is built into us, might it also be that consciousness itself is reflecting something that's out there. And it isn't just, as many materialists have questioned, it isn't just this accidental random byproduct of a larger brain that just as if the spirit of masculinity, as we talk about the spirit of masculinity, if the spirit of masculinity is an expression, is the product of something out there, might not consciousness also be too? Might there in fact be a consciousness that is the source of all of our subconscious, of all our underling consciousnesses and subconsciousness too? Might there actually be a mind, a father mind, of which we are all his children? He's saying that's not an unreasonable idea.
And that might involve whatever it is that God is.
Well, so that's why I think this is so interesting, because what you're doing there, especially at the end, is you're giving it a little room to say, I don't know.
This is such a modern meme. He keeps saying he doesn't know. He keeps saying he's working on it, and this is part of the tribal conversations we're having.
Right?
Well, you have to.
Yeah, but I think that's what people don't want to grant you.
Well,
guys.
this is why I don't like the question. Do you believe in God? Right. It's like, well, that's like, it's, to me, that question is always like, well, what makes you so sure that you know that God exists? And it's like, well, I'm not sure. I'm not willing to claim that certainty, you know, but I laid out the argument. I don't know what you think.
So what do you think about when he takes it all the way to that end, and then there's that little space at the end?
I mean, again, I don't think that that's severely problematic in terms of just general religious thought. I mean, the general religious thought going back thousands of years, and this is why when you look at Aquinas' proofs of God, what he comes to is he says basically what you say, which is if you go down deep enough, then you get to something. And that something is what we call God. So he doesn't say God, the Bible starts from the premise God exists and he created the universe. Aquinas starts from, we have a universe, what says God is there? And he says, well, when you go all the way down deep enough, there has to be a force that lies behind the combined logic of the universe, and that thing is what we call God, right? And so he's trying to reason his way back to first principles. And I think that the case for God, not in the way that we think of him as like a jolly bearded guy in the sky.
Although, you know, Peterson made a pretty compelling argument that even though now Shapiro, you know, he's got a yarmulke on. We're not going to represent God in terms of anything that God has made in his creation. That is a commandment that Christians and Jews ought to keep.
Like takes care of all of our problems or anything, but the idea that there is a logos, right? There's a structure, a fundamental structure to the way life is.
Brought in John 1.
And there is a reason and a fundamental purpose to why life is, and what lies below that you can call God, and that
consciousness has some association with it.
Right
there, that's really important.
There is a reason and a fundamental purpose to why life is, and what lies below that you can call God. And
consciousness has some association with it.
God number 2.
Your consciousness reflects God. Again, this is one of the fundamental. This is sort of Leibniz's proof of God, is that the principle of sufficient reason, the idea that you are capable of understanding the universe. If you actually believe you're capable of understanding the universe in any way, then your mind has to, if you believe in objective reality, as Sam does, and you believe that your mind is capable of grasping an objective reality, not an evolutionarily beneficial reality, but an objective reality, your mind is reflecting a greater mind, right? Your mind is reflecting a greater logic. Well, what stands behind that greater logic? It must be something, right? And so this is the idea that there is a God that stands behind that. So the proof for God, I think, honestly, is not supremely difficult, and I think that we all do have, whether it's biologically sourced or, in my view, logically sourced, a belief that there is a structure to the universe, a predictable structure to the universe that didn't emerge out of simple randomness, and there's a reason that things are the way that they are, and that from that we can draw the fact that we are capable of acting within that logical universe. If everything were sheer chaos, you could not act. You'd be paralyzed.
Now he's getting into natural law, that there's a natural order to things, that there is a created order, and that functioning within this created order yields outcomes that can be predicted.
Paralyzed by the chaos that surrounds you.
So would you both argue then that at a micro level and at the individual level, you could live a perfectly good, decent life?
We're going to have to get into this some more. One of the things I wanted to do, though, was I've got a bunch of videos queued up here. What's interesting when I listen to this, and we're talking about God number 2, Jonathan Pageau. So God number 1, stuff built into the world. In a sense, God of the natural order, the God who selects. And so when a bullet whizzes by and takes out Sasha, Eric Weinstein's great uncle, and where is God in that? God is that which selects. God is that which chooses. This is where you get into providence. Heidelberg Catechism, Lord's Day 10, God brings fat years and lean years. Now, there's some Christians, when we get into Christian theology has been chewing all this stuff forever. And so even when I say it in that way, I'm giving a representation. And the challenge of Christian theology, of theology at all, or thought or language at all, is to try to give the best representation that fits, that most accurately reflects reality. And this is what's difficult with us. But I thought when we got into the consciousness part here, this is basically what Pageau has been trying to do all along. This is from his November question and answer.
Okay, so Anjo Terpstra says, Einstein
Terpstra, good Dutch name.
stated that
Frisian, in fact.
he believed in the God of Spinoza, who reveals himself in the harmony of all that exists. He did not believe in a personal God who concerns himself with fates and actions of human beings, a view which he describes as naive. Does your perception of God fit into any of these definitions? Would you say that your God is a personal God, and in what matter? Now, this problem stems from the problem that I've been trying to help you guys understand from the beginning. It is the problem of ignoring the reality of consciousness.
Now again, when Peterson talks about modernity and the fork that modernity made by excluding subjectivity and basically creating the split between the subjective and the objective, eliminating the subjective and trying to isolate the objective, as Thomas Nagel said, you put a fork into culture, you put a fork into philosophy, and this proved very powerful in terms of gaining a handle on a certain aspect of the world. But even Hoffman says, but that technically isn't objective. We're still living with representations between us and whatever the strangeness of the real world truly is, and we have a sense of that now with modern physics. But the split here, so this is what Jonathan has been working on right from the beginning. This is why he's making videos. This is why he's talking about symbolism. He's saying, I'm trying to reintegrate the subjective into the conversation. And this, of course, is what Thomas Nagel in his book, Mind and Cosmos, says. Well, we're at a point now where we've pretty much exhausted the benefits that we have gotten from splitting the subjective and the objective, from splitting consciousness out of the program. And Thomas Nagel's fear is, well, he's not so sure that you can put Humpty Dumpty back together again. Jonathan, in a sense, is a real conservative in that he says, yeah, I'm using a computer, I'm using modern technology, I'm using all this, but when it comes to how we govern, I want to inhabit the pre-modern world. I want to worship within the pre-modern world.
Of acting as if consciousness has no bearing in the world. Acting as if personhood either didn't exist or isn't important or is just taken for granted, maybe. That's probably the best way to see it. To think as if personhood and the point of self-consciousness is taken for granted. And so then we look out and we try to imagine the infinite, and somehow we find it naive to think that the manner in which I look at the infinite, the manner in which I am the only creature that we know of on earth who is able to even ponder the question of the infinite, that the capacity that I have to ponder the infinite, which somehow it is naive to think that that would somehow mirror the infinite. It's like, to me, that's just, I don't understand how people can get to that. I don't understand why it bothers people that God is mind, that God is person, that God is infinite consciousness. I don't understand why that bothers people.
And this is, Jonathan is dealing with the main objection. This is Sam Harris's objection to God number 2. This is Sam Harris's objection that God, in fact, would care for us, which is what the psalmist understands. It's a very understandable thing to say. Why should the maker of a universe the likes of which we experience care about me? That's a very reasonable question, because we know hierarchies, and in a sense, the reason when Jordan Peterson sent me that little email is because he's on a different hierarchy than me. Now, obviously, our hierarchies are very complicated. There's other hierarchies, like in the Christian Reformed Church. Jordan Peterson has no status. I have status in the Christian Reformed Church, but in this other hierarchy, Jordan Peterson's very high status. He sent me a nice condolence note about my sister. Well, he cared for me. And so the psalmist says, why should God care for me? And this is a major objection to the idea of relating to God. But what Jonathan is saying here is that, but why would you exclude God from even this power that the tiny little likes of us have? In other words, if you make the argument, well, now he's not a creature, that God should care for me because I'm small is difficult. Well, let's flip that around and say, well, even you who are small have consciousness. Why would you exclude that from the source of the universe? That makes no sense. That makes no sense at all, in fact. Why would, in a sense, we who have this little experience of consciousness, which is, as Brett Weinstein says in his Rebel Wisdom interviews, an incredibly powerful tool, why would you imagine that our source would be lacking this? And that our source could, if our source desires, if our source has will, if our source has choice, if our source selects, picks and chooses God number 1, if our source has this, why wouldn't our source, if he wishes, get involved in our affairs? Well, I just can't imagine that would happen. Why? Because you've lived 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 years, and one person on top of one other hierarchy hasn't bothered? Well, let's map this out to all time. Because, again, time is not a finite resource in the universe. We experience it as a finite resource because we are finite, because we are little. But why would you exclude from the great source that which we have, even in tiny measures? And to a degree, even my dog has consciousness, okay? Even the cow that produced the beef for Jordan Peterson's steak has a degree of consciousness. So I love Jonathan's rant here.
And so the question of the problem is that we're so scientific. We only think in quantitative manners, and so we don't understand how qualitative things work. And so when we think of God who answers your prayers, the only reason why it bothers us is because we have to imagine a God that is in space and in time somewhere.
And we have trouble with that for all of the reasons that I just said. We have trouble imagining it. So whose limitation are we really bumping up against? We're bumping up against our limited imagination, not God's capacity.
And he's there, like tabulating a calculator, and he's answering your prayers. Like, that's not, why does it have to be that way? why if you participate, if you come from the infinite divine mind, that is your origin, why does it bother you that you can interact with your origin, and that origin can interact with you? To me, it's maybe it's like maybe it's because to me I find that people are not, like I said, people just take consciousness for granted, and I think that's the problem. Once you start to understand, once you start to put consciousness back into the chains of causalities, which is what I'm always saying, then all of a sudden, the infinite, the infinite God has to, that aspect of you has to also reflect the infinite. And that's all, I guess that's all I can say. And so I don't have a problem with God answering prayers at all. I don't have a problem with that at all. And I know that it happens to people all the time. And I don't have a problem with miracles. I don't have a problem with, I don't have a problem with that in any way.
Me neither. I'm going to stop this here. I'm going to compile it. That there's a section that's coming up here where we get into agency that Esther O'Reilly and a number of people said, oh, you really got to talk about this, because in many ways, Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson they don't know enough theological history. So of Protestant Catholic issues. I'm not saying Ben Shapiro is lacking in terms of Jewish theological history. He knows far more about that than I do. But so I want to do that, and I'm going to do that in a separate video. So, but this was God number 1 and God number 2, Jordan Peterson, laying it all out there.